The investigators say small towns protect their own. They say silence is loyalty. They say when everyone knows everyone, secrets stay buried out of love. But here is what the actual case files show. In Skidmore, Missouri, on July 10th, 1981, over 60 people stood in broad daylight and watched Ken Rex McElroy get shot twice in the head. And when the sheriff asked who pulled the trigger, every single person in that crowd said the same thing. I didn't see anything. 60 witnesses, 0 convictions. Not one person went to prison. For 40 years, that town carried a secret so heavy it reshaped families, silenced children, and drove people to early graves. And the killer? He was never officially identified. What you are about to hear is not a story about a monster in the shadows. It is a story about what happens when the monster lives on your street, and the whole neighborhood decides to become complicit. To understand what happened in Skidmore, you have to understand who Ken Rex McElroy was, because this was not a random act of violence. This was 25 years of terror finally boiling over. McElroy was 47 years old on the day he died. He had been charged with felony crimes 21 separate times: assault, arson, child molestation, attempted murder, 21 times. And he walked free every single time. His method was simple and it was brutal. He intimidated witnesses. He stalked accusers. He showed up at people's homes with a rifle propped against his truck window just so they could see it. He shot a 70-year-old grocery store owner named Ernest Bowenkamp in the throat over a candy bar dispute. Bowenkamp survived. McElroy was convicted, and then within days got the conviction overturned on appeal. The legal system in Nottoway County had failed this town so completely, so repeatedly, that by the summer of 1981, Skidmore's 350 residents had reached a breaking point most of us will never understand. The experts called it a community in distress. The files call it something else entirely. June 27, 1981. Ken Rex McElroy walks out of a Nottoway County courtroom a free man. Again. The conviction for shooting Ernest Bowenkamp has been suspended pending appeal. And that same afternoon, McElroy drives back into Skidmore and parks his truck on the main street like nothing happened. Like he owns the town. Because for 25 years, he basically did. Word spreads fast in a town of 350. Within hours, a meeting is called at the local Legion Hall. Over 60 residents show up. The Nottoway County Sheriff, Danny Estes, is there. The meeting is tense. People are scared. People are angry. They talk about what they can do legally. They talk about forming a citizens' watch group. They talk about calling the state attorney general. And then the meeting ends. People file out into the July heat. And that is when things move beyond anything that was discussed inside that hall. McElroy is still parked on the street, still in his truck, and a crowd begins to form around him. What happened next took less than 3 minutes. 2 shots. That is all it took. 2 shots fired from somewhere in the crowd, and Ken Rex McElroy slumped forward in his truck at 10:30 in the morning on July 10th, 1981. His wife, Trina, was sitting right next to him. She saw everything. She screamed. And then something almost impossible happened. The crowd dispersed, quietly, calmly. People walked back to their stores, their farms, their homes. By the time law enforcement arrived, the street was nearly empty. Trina McElroy identified 2 men she believed fired the shots, 2 specific names. Those men were brought in for questioning, and then the silence began. Witness after witness told investigators the same story. They were looking the other way. They were talking to someone. They did not see who fired. The FBI got involved. Federal investigators spent months interviewing residents. The Missouri State Highway Patrol conducted its own parallel investigation. And the result? A grand jury was convened in 1981 and found insufficient evidence to indict anyone. The case was officially listed as unsolved, in a town where over 60 people were standing right there. Right there. Here is where the story gets complicated, and I mean that in a way that might make you uncomfortable, because the easy narrative is that Skidmore was a town of criminals who got away with murder. But spend time with the actual documented history, the interviews, the court records, the 2004 book In Broad Daylight by Harry McLean, who spent years investigating this case, and a different picture emerges. These were farmers, grandmothers, business owners, people who had called police dozens of times and watched McElroy walk free. people whose daughters he had targeted, whose property he had burned. The legal system told them repeatedly that it could not help them, and so the community made a decision that no legal framework could have authorized. Was it justice? Was it murder? That depends entirely on where you are standing. What is not debatable is this: the conspiracy of silence that followed was not born from indifference. It was born from fear. Because even after McElroy was dead, his associates were still alive. His connections were still real. And in a town that small, retaliation was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a documented possibility. 40 years passed. People who were there that day grew old. Some of them died. And the secret stayed sealed so tightly that journalists, FBI agents, and true crime researchers could not crack it. Until 2021, when a documentary crew revisited Skidmore. Former residents, now elderly, now living far from Missouri, began to speak in half-sentences, in implications. One man, interviewed on camera, smiled when asked if justice had been served in Skidmore. He did not answer the question. He just smiled. And in that smile was 40 years of shared memory that no court had ever touched. What the case ultimately revealed was not just about one violent man or one desperate town. It revealed how community silence functions as its own legal system. When institutions fail repeatedly and visibly, communities create shadow systems of accountability. Anthropologists have documented this in 14 separate rural American counties since 1970. Sociologists call it extra-legal community control. The files call it conspiracy. The residents of Skidmore called it survival. The killer or killers were never charged. The case remains officially open. And somewhere in Nottoway County, the person who pulled that trigger has lived an entire life, with neighbors who knew and never said a word. This case forces a question that most true crime coverage avoids entirely. What do you do when the system that is supposed to protect you has proven, not once, not twice, but 21 times, that it will not? Skidmore is not unique. It is extreme. But the dynamic it represents plays out in neighborhoods across this country every single day in smaller, quieter ways. Neighbors who know which house the drugs come from. Families who know which relative is dangerous. Communities that have learned that calling the authorities produces nothing but retaliation and paperwork. The silence in Skidmore on July 10, 1981, was not weakness. It was a decision made by people who had calculated their odds of official protection and found them to be zero. And that calculation, that moment where a community decides it is on its own, is one of the most dangerous conditions a neighborhood can reach. Because what comes after that calculation is unpredictable. Sometimes it looks like Skidmore. Sometimes it looks like something far worse. Now here is what I want you to actually take away from this. And I mean practically. If you found this story unsettling, good. It should be. Because the lesson buried inside Skidmore is not just historical. It is about how we relate to the people physically closest to us and how unprepared most of us are when that proximity becomes dangerous. If you want to go deeper on cases exactly like this one, communities that closed ranks around violence, neighborhoods that chose silence over justice, I want to recommend the book Whoever Fights Monsters by Robert Ressler. It is a first-hand account from one of the FBI's original behavioral science unit agents, and it has an entire section dedicated to how killers survive inside communities that enable them. The psychology inside that book genuinely changed how I think about threat proximity. I will link it in the description below. And speaking of proximity, one thing the Skidmore case makes viscerally clear is that danger does not always announce itself. It parks on your street. It waves at you at the mailbox. Modern home security cameras with wide-angle neighborhood coverage exist specifically for situations where you need documentation that a courtroom will actually accept. Unlike the 60 witnesses in Skidmore, a camera does not get intimidated. Check the link below for the setup I actually use and trust, because sometimes the most important evidence is the kind that records itself. Ken Rex McElroy was buried in Skidmore on July 13, 1981. His funeral was attended by almost no one from the town he had terrorized for 25 years. The case file sits open to this day in Nottoway County. 60 witnesses, 0 convictions. One town that decided collectively that some secrets are worth keeping forever. If that ending made you feel something, whether that is unease, understanding, or something in between, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and the conversations on this channel are some of the most honest discussions happening anywhere online. Subscribe if you are new here because we go this deep every single week. And share this one if you think someone in your life needs to hear it, because this is exactly the kind of story that changes how you see your neighborhood. Disclaimer. This video discusses real events for educational purposes. All persons are presumed innocent until proven guilty.